Hi, welcome. I have 2:58 on my watch, so we have a couple more minutes. I think we are at 3 p.m., so we might still have some attendees trickling in, but are you okay to get started, Jessica?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So hello and welcome to this session. This is our last concurrent session of the day, one of two, and it's entitled Integrating Open Educational Resource Practice and Feminist Pedagogy in Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies. Thank you all for being here. My name is Manon Allard-Krupp, and I'm an instructional designer with Missouri Online, with the University of Missouri System, and I will be your moderator. Before I briefly introduce our speaker, Dr. Jessica Turkett, I just have a few logistical items to cover, the usual ones. So first, live captioning is available during this presentation, and you can toggle this on and off using the attendee controls at the bottom of your screen. So the icon will look like two capital C letters. And this session is being recorded, and the recording, as well as there is no slides, so no slides. The recording will be provided on the conference website following the end of the conference, and I will put a link to that in the chat in just a few moments. Please enter all of your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll most likely answer them at the end of the session. We'll leave some time for that. And if you, we encourage you as well to engage with us and with the other attendees through the chat function. So please if possible, keep the chat function for just engaging and discussion, and then the Q&A box for questions so we don't miss them. And if you have any technical issues, please contact Tracy Stout at missouristate.edu. Tracy Stout at missouristate.edu, and I will also put this in the chat in a second. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this session, Dr. Jessica Turkett. She teaches for the Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies program at Oklahoma State University. And her latest work has appeared in San Diego Poetry Annual, Indiana Review, Rewilding Anthology, Poems for the Environment, and Springer Future Education and Learning Spaces book series entitled Aspects of Open Educational Resources in Higher Education, A Global Perspective. So I will now pass it on to our speaker, Dr. Turkett, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for introducing me. And also thank you for inviting me to MSU. I actually got my undergraduate and master's at MSU. So I'm very happy to be back even in a virtual setting. And thank you for Tracy for the communication back and forth setting this up. So I know a lot of hard work goes into this. The Springer title that you just heard is the anthology where my work was just published, and so I'm kind of drawing from that essay to discuss my experiences teaching open education resources in the feminist classes, an intro class, a body politics class, and then a class, smaller upper division class focused exclusively on mothering. And I thought I would start by talking about feminist pedagogy and then about the implementation of OER resources, and then follow up with the praxis and some classroom observations I have made before my overall conclusions. So just to start with, talking about feminist scholars and instructors continually question their selection of the authors and resources that they use to support theories or ground class lessons. The ongoing dilemma for those in my position, those who facilitate conversations on the complexities of gender theory between students with novice and burgeoning feminist curiosity that is most often derived from Western mass media, is multifaceted, and it cannot be tackled with a one-size-fits-all approach. So in a world where politicians and pop stars' tweets are broadcast to millions of viewers within seconds, and a running list of call-out culture's newly unearthed scandals is available 24/7, feminist instructors must decide how to clear the way for deeply focused debates on new information or a new perspective on a given topic when it materializes and sheds light on the problematic nature of pre-selected authors or texts. And I give a lot of examples of this. One that often stands out in the English communities and in the feminist community is Walt Whitman. We don't think of him as being a problematic person, but if you look at his work and then his life, and raises the question of teaching Walt Whitman in a feminist class. So this approach then requires feminists to make choices about the materials that they select and reselect, and constantly changing the class curriculum as new information comes out, or as histories and institutions morph and the production of subject knowledge changes. So feminist scholars and instructors have long argued that the translation of feminist pedagogy to online education environments is critical. Adding to that charge is the need for to consider how integrating OER practices and feminist pedagogy align. So feminist pedagogy asks instructors to pivot their instruction with the various identities of each student within each class, as well as consider how various student identities come together to form a collective class identity. So not hard at all. So such an endeavor requires that feminist instructors give serious attention to how gender, race, sexuality, age, disability, ability, religion, nationality, and other social identities manifest in the classroom. Feminist instructors must continually expand the ways to talk about the complexity of identity, asking students to acknowledge their own power and privilege, and perhaps most saliently, due to the reliance on OER, their positionality at the beginning of the class, at the end of the class, within the culture at large. So overall, my general observation is that embracing OER within the gender, women, sexuality, feminist classrooms, and feminist pedagogical goals are bolstered in the long run. Though the switch to complete reliance on OER requires an initial investment in time and energy on the part of the instructor, OER can be particularly effective when empowering students to co-construct knowledge, learning from one another by introducing topics adjacent to the course themes that surface organically throughout the semester. That's not to say that OER usage is not without its drawbacks. I can address that if we have time or in the Q&A, but I fully support, I'm fully in favor of marrying feminist pedagogy and OER. So OER usage requires faculty to locate foundational course materials that are available for free through public digital libraries, or which access is available with already required student fees through their specific university library. It's just kind of basic definition. So when making OER selections, faculty must also ensure their courses are delving into the objectives they are designed to confront within the university, while teaching courses or complementing other contractual obligations during the semester before implementing the OER. So there's quite a bit of work at the front end before implementing OER. So professors don't assign books by major publishers or books with access codes because they want their students to suffer. They do it most often because it is easier, because they are negotiating several demands in their position. And an increasing number of universities are replacing full-time tenured staff with adjunct professors, which then the adjuncts, many of whom are graduate students themselves, are paid by the course, and they typically don't receive benefits, and occasionally they find out they're teaching a class at the last minute, a few weeks before the class begins. And so all of this starts to compound and results in the fact that they don't necessarily have the time and the resources to spend the summer developing a lesson plan to work alongside librarians, or to find quality materials that won't come then at a high cost to the students. So the result is a world where students and professors are constantly struggling, and the easier answer is to go with a traditional one textbook for one fee, and then just replicate that throughout as many classes as possible. The adoption of OER then will require additional time and resources on the part of the instructor. Without, this is my argument, without sufficient support, the challenge will prevent instructors from using OER. While defaulting to a standard textbook may initially assist a professor in quickly scaffolding a course and ensuring that students in various sections receive a set of criteria required by the institution and department housing the course, such an approach simultaneously limits the instructor's ability to seamlessly revise course materials once the class gets started, and the outcome can result in a rigid daily syllabus. And the reason why I embarked on OER uses is because I constantly was kind of hitting that rigid class dynamic, to where I wanted to include more materials, but I just did not have the time to do that. So I applied for a grant through the university, and I highly recommend that universities support that. It was through the library system, which gave me a small stipend to then work with a librarian to implement OER. And I embarked on that journey in 2020. And so I had no idea, like the rest of the world, that we'd be gripped by a novel coronavirus, and that all face-to-face classes would morph into online and shift midway through the semester. But I did find that rendered the need for OER even more it was more important than ever at that point. And so the class went in new directions that I could never imagine. I couldn't have imagined that students would be masked in a body politics class, or that then we would be 6 feet apart, and all of the lesson plans, the bodily activities I had planned were moot at that point. So one of the hallmarks of feminist pedagogy is to build community while decentering the role of the instructor. And had I not been able to rely on the OERs and have students take the lead in locating additional sources, then that challenge I would not have been able to meet during 2020. I would have fell flat, I guarantee it. But I have the book Teaching with Tenderness Toward an Embodied Practice, and I started implementing Becky Thompson's work as I was developing the OER. So part of my mothering is an embodied mothering practice, and I found this and I thought, oh, wonderful, applying embodiment to a class, and it's fantastic. I highly recommend it. Written in 2017, but Thompson argues that students typically enter the classroom feeling separate from each other. And while they may come with and sit by a friend, most have been socialized to draw in once the class begins, to sit in their own chairs, use their own notebooks, to think as an individual, to not use the cell phone that they have right there to look up anything. And so the re-socialization process to see themselves as part of a larger collective and to listen deeply to each other, to set aside grades and to set aside the initial impulse or resistance or personal experience toward a certain subject, but to take care of each other, to the other students in the class, intellectually and emotionally, is part of an embodied feminist praxis, and to help people remember their feeling of belonging and connection as the core of the class. So this community building is particularly challenging within online classes, where identity is easily masked and skewed by the presence of a constructed virtual avatar, or classes where enrollment has been bloated to achieve a certain academic quota, going directly against initial feminist class endeavors. And I'm not arguing that the use of avatars, this can all be very engaging and very important in thinking about feminist approaches and queering student identity in very unique digital ways. But as the instructor, it poses quite a lot of challenges in terms of community building, though it has its benefits. So in order to facilitate community building, I personally spend a lot of time at the beginning of the semester ascertaining why students are taking a particular class, as well as having them relate to one another. And these are often perfunctory and simple Q&A exercises, but they do offer a foundation for the expectation as the class progresses. So students understand from the very first day of the class that the expectation is to relate to one another and to the world in which they live. So this maps onto bell hooks and lies at the center of a feminist value system. So the classes that I teach at OSU fulfill what's called a D, or diversity requirement, and they result in perennially high enrollment in the class. So frequently when I ask why are students here, I get the response, I'm here to get a D. So I hear that a lot, which is with its own drawbacks as well, but it doesn't dishearten me, because for every student that I have that it's like, I'm here to get a D and just get it done with, I also have students who are very excited and find it refreshing to have a class where they can ask these questions that they're thinking, and have a community where they wrestle with these topics that are very much in our mainstream media right now. So I continue to ask the question at the beginning of the semester for my own notes to see how it changes over time. 15 years ago when I started teaching, I would very frequently get the responses like, I'm here to meet women or chicks or girls, or I want to know what women want, so I'm taking this class, and that has gone away. So I think, there is slow progression on that. And so what I'm not doing at the beginning of the class since implementing OER is I'm not asking whether or not they've bought their textbook, whether or not they know what the required textbook is, and if they had any difficulty in the textbook store, or if they brought their text to class that day, or if it's a heavy and they're having back problem. All of these things emerged when I was using the larger anthologies. And as the semester progresses, I'm not asking whether I need to cut class discussions short to get to certain assigned readings that were required from the textbook in order to justify the hefty price tags that students paid for the latest edition, or even to justify them lugging it to class. Maybe they have multiple classes throughout the day, and they'd be carrying 4 of those around. Nor am I questioning whether I've wrangled enough class discussion in such a manner that we can make direct connections to at least one of the essays in the textbook during our class meetings. I am not left contemplating whether students felt the transition from one unit to another was jarring or disjointed, because I didn't plan enough by using the prefabricated unit structure from the textbook, and so this tends to be highly prescriptive, and in that process it decenters the students' voices, and they very quickly internalize that and just go along with the course, as opposed to taking co-ownership over the lessons. So back to Thompson, she starts with opening rituals and closing rituals, and I don't necessarily do that, but it's beneficial to think about from day one how you are going to introduce OERs and the usage to the classroom as a positive, and showing the benefits, and in doing so, slowing the pace of the class, and hearing what is important to each student, taking that time, investing in their voices, and then drafting your daily reading syllabus based upon what you heard from their introductions and the OERs that you've already gathered in conjunction with the library. So feminist instructors often face the contradiction of working within an exclusionary hierarchical power structure, where the institutional requirement they are implicitly expected to uphold runs counter to the social justice mindedness of what they are teaching. So examining that as you're drafting your OER courses. And then there's the reality that just some students are intimidated by the physical nature of an academic textbook. So this is what struck me the most and really made me reach out and contact the university, was because it seemed foreign to me. I have a stack of right here, I have like 20 books right here, and that's pretty common for instructors. We're used to having bookcases and, you know, reading books over winter and summer breaks for entertainment. But if you put yourself in the role of a student who perhaps hasn't had that experience and doesn't like reading, and then they're in college for the first time, they have several classes, and then you hand them a big thick book and say, we're going to read this and maybe some others through the semester. It goes against the flashing billboards and the friends direct messaging and the social media consumption of and their thought of reading. And this was made very apparent to me when I was teaching an honors class nonetheless, and I had a student struggling. We were supposed to read 13 paperbacks about this size, 13 of them. It's a 16-week course, so first and last, and then about a book a week. And the student was having a really difficult time, even at an honors level course. And so I talked with him, what's going on? And the student explained to me that they would get home, it's an online class, so they'd say, okay, I need to do my work and log on to the classroom and then find what I had assigned, and then look around their dorm room and find the book, and then hold it in their hand and kind of flip through it and realize, oh, before I start this, I really need something to eat. Get up, get something to eat. I'm going to check my messages. and then from there, it would just kind of unravel, and the student would get distracted basically and never actually return to the textbook. And they were describing this as very daunting. And so the English professor in me was thinking, that's called reading. That is expected in the university level courses, and definitely in an honors level class. And this is a literature class, so we're going to read literature. But the feminist instructor side of me said, you've got to meet the students where they are. You've got to find a way to bridge that gap. So I went to my other classes. They were not online classes at that time, and I kind of just, they're face-to-face. I started throwing that out to the students. Like, I talked to somebody and they said they were struggling with this. And I looked, and almost everyone in the class was like nodding that that was very difficult to them, and that they would much prefer digital texts. And so that's where I went at that point, even though it seems foreign to many professors. I went and started talking to the librarians and saying, how can we get digital texts? And so regardless of whether their exhaustion from reading textbooks was justified in my mind, the fact remained that semester after semester, a certain percentage of students were not completing the assigned textbook reading. And even with a robust class community, the discussion would fall flat because the students were drained and had only marginally skimmed at best the textbook reading. So then I was confronted with, do I give quizzes, pop with additional writing assignments to make sure they're doing the reading? But basically it kept crumbling throughout the semester because of the lack of reading. So these options would have left even less room for intimacy and vulnerability during the class discussions, and it would have positioned me outside of the feminist pedagogical approaches, where then I'm the instructor doling out and monitoring and checking their educational journey, rather than guiding them and following them at times along that path. So I did know that's how I began to implement the OER usage. And I'm going to skip on down to my classroom observations now after implementing it. So in addition to bolstering students' connections to one another, the personal relationships that students could build with the course themes were particularly important to my OER design. Thompson emphasizes, since many topics that are raised in feminist classrooms directly relate to people's lives and lived experiences in the world, students need to be able to talk about how they relate to the class content. So to continue building community and get students talking about the course themes, that is what I tapped into when selecting the OER materials. And I rely a lot on popular culture. I did that at Missouri State too when I was a graduate student there. But my strong opinion is that students
Yes, I think we, based on the chat, I think we may have lost the connection.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I think we lost you for a minute, but
Oh.
it's, yes, yeah, there was a little glitch. We're good. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. So, so one of the drawbacks of relying on OER is that some students and colleagues consider the student-led nature of the course, along with the stereotyping of feminist classes and evaluation of those cast aside and left behind works and voices, as undermining the scholastic merit of the course. Then couple that with adding popular culture, so it can very quickly result in some students and colleagues checking out or not taking the class seriously. So operating outside of the comfortable framework means that feminist instructors risk being dismissed and labeled unprofessional within their field. And I really did find this to be representative of the class expectations in the intro class. So I teach about 89 students in my introductory courses, and I run those every single semester. And I have found that allowing them to create their own syllabus and derive it from pop culture, it takes up so much time to do that. And there is so much resistance from incoming freshmen or sophomores in not viewing it as a serious endeavor, that I have opted now to set certain OERs required every week. And so if the students want to bring in and supplement the required OER readings that I have assigned, that's absolutely fine. But the class is already pre-scaffolded. And the daily syllabus is provided at the very beginning of the semester. And I can go into that in the Q&A and discuss more about why I made that decision. But in the upper level classes, in the body politics class and feminist mothering, I allow a much more fluid, multi-dimensional forms of knowledge to engage the students. So the body image class presents a particular obstacle since approximately half who sign up are minoring in GWST or majoring, and then the other half have never even taken an introductory GWST course. So it's often balanced, and I pair them very strategically after about a week in class so that they can facilitate one another's learning, and the classes don't become bifurcated by doing that. And so one example of the way I approach the class in the body image classes, I leave very open-ended instructions. Locate sources on sex positive and or body positive activism, and then I link it through the library system through their OER resource pages. And so students then have the weekend to go look at that, and find their own titles and essays that stand out to them. Then they bring it back to class, and I further ask, how does sex positive or body positive activism go beyond mainstream movements that promote self-care and encourage individuals to simply love their body? So that I have about 55 students in that class, and they can join the conversation from various points, regardless of their level of understanding of the field of GWST or their investment in that. They can present the prepared materials or talk about their personal relationship with such activism, or even the contradictions in the mainstream movements of these topics. But myself as a professor, I'm just sitting kind of back, seeing what they introduce and how they take that very broad topic and then concretize it. And I encourage students to fully acknowledge their identity construction through the power of response, and encourage them to become critical thinkers in ways that enable students to once again address their own positionality in the classroom, in the culture at large. And often I have found that students feel comfortable mentioning social media posts and pop cultural opinions and representations that are aligned with the themes, and that the resistance that they receive is not necessarily internalized or taken personally. So if somebody says, I'm not a fan of Star Wars, or I didn't watch The Handmaid's Tale because of this, they don't actually, if students push back against that, it's seen as them pushing back against that pop culture or that mass media, not as a representation of the person who watched it. There were a few exceptions to this, such as the show Shameless. Students had really strong opinions about that, about people should not be watching that. And so as a feminist, to even watch it was to support something. So there's some exceptions, but overall, allowing them to bring in the pop culture that aligns with our feminist topics. So now in the I'm going to skip ahead here to where I'm able to follow what Sarah Ahmed calls the desire lines, the student-led desire lines. And she has a whole chapter of that in Living a Feminist Life. And I saw this when subjects arise that I don't have an extensive knowledge. And one of those topics is sports. I admittedly don't follow sports. And so when students wanted to discuss football, OSU is a football culture, and they were gravitating to Colin Kaepernick and his infamously defiant taking a knee, we had gathered that his return to NFL seemed unlikely. So the class is talking about this political stance in terms of body politics, and some students thought that was absolutely fair and others thought it wasn't fair. And so letting them grapple with that. And then another student started saying, well, have you heard about, Serena Williams in tennis? And I was quietly listening and listening to those desire lines. And after a minute or so, a student said, has anyone seen that cartoon? And kind of whispered it, like, that cartoon about Serena Williams, and I hadn't. And so we were able to pull it up on the screen and project it. And again, the students were not judging the students who had seen it, or even, they were able to recognize that they were analyzing the illustrators and the publishers and the social media statements about this racist, sexist, perhaps cartoon. And we spent the remainder of the class then discussing the explicit racism and sexism from the image. And perhaps for making the realization for the first time, I had a student who said, like, it's not just tennis. Like, think how many sports are almost exclusively for white players: hockey, ice skating, gymnastics, ballet. And then the class just went silent. And I took that moment then to say, I have an essay about Serena Williams that I have never taught before. I had already previously worked through the library system and assured that they had the text and that it was an OER. But I told the class, I'm curious to know what you make of this text about Serena Williams. And so the students could sense my genuineness, and I wanted to learn from them. And in turn, that made them want to learn from me. And so before they left, I was able to pull up this cover jacket from Claudia Rankine's Citizen: An American Lyric. And this picture is called In the Hood. And as I'm showing this, I could feel the curiosity swell in the classroom, and they wanted to understand what was happening in this book. So in the final moments of the class, I read the back jacket of it. It says, you take in things you don't want to hear all the time. The second you hear or see some ordinary moment, all its intended targets, all the meanings behind the retreating seconds, as far as you're able to see, come into focus. Hold up. Did you just hear that? Did you just say that? Did you just see that? Did you just do that? Then the voice in your head silently tells you to take your foot off your throat, because just getting along shouldn't be an ambition. So at that point, I directed the class to the OER that I was going to place for them to read before our next classroom. And I told them I wanted to focus on Zora Neale Hurston's poetic line, I feel most colored when thrown against a sharp white background. And that's a refrain in this text. So I didn't clearly understand where we were going in the class. I didn't know where we were heading, but I was no longer concerned. I recognized that OER was working, and the students came back very energized and carried the class through the rest of the semester because they were confident to take the reins. We had kind of co-constructed this desire line using OERs and a feminist pathway. So since OER implementation, I've taught over 600 students, and I'm by and large, I'm really impressed by how successful it is. I recommend, that this questioning is beneficial to see how your university could support that endeavor. And I think I'll probably just, stop with my thesis would be implementing OER praxis in the feminist pedagogy. It requires additional labor and energy on the part of instructors. It requires working in tandem with the library support, and a lot of reading and kind of accepting where the class might go ahead of time, kind of feeling that out. And it's especially complicated when given how feminist instructors necessarily problematize every text and subject selection as it might align with multifaceted feminist values. But with additional attention given to new instructors and instructors with heavy course loads, then OER usage can streamline feminist pedagogical goals if university and departmental support are efficiently provided. And I thank you for listening, and I welcome lots of questions because I could go on about this much longer.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Turquette. If we have, I don't see any questions in the chat or the Q&A, but we're a pretty small group. So I think if anybody wants to just unmute themselves or ask their questions in the chat, feel free to go ahead and do that. I think for me, it was really interesting to hear about how kind of, when you mentioned the resocialization process very early on, how OER helped you kind of help students resocialize both in the COVID classroom with COVID precautions and then being online. That was very interesting to me. And it was also quite interesting to hear that for your students, it was really helpful to have digital versions of their text of their readings. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how, like in practice, where was these OER readings hosted? So you said, I think through the library website. Yeah, because for me, I've always heard some students say that it's online and I get distracted because it's digital, which is kind of like, it's really interesting that for some students, it's helpful to have it on paper. And for your students, it's really interesting to have them digitally. So if you want to tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and I still get in the feminist mothering class, I kind of get both. Like some students who are primarily identify as mothers or caretakers, some of them need a hard copy. They might be breastfeeding or rocking a baby and don't want the phone. Like they like that hard copy, or they can take it with them, and or it's just comfortable. That's what they used to use when they're returning to college at a later date. And so the tech can be intimidating, but I will say for the majority of classes, having, and especially when I teach online classes, they're already on an online portal. If you can link it to the library, and they'll have these large databases, and I justify it to students. I think you're already paying for this through your student fees. Let's utilize this resource. And a lot of English classes do that already. Composition courses do it, and so I was able to seamlessly transition my composition approach into the feminist classes. But I find where students get distracted online is if it's just like, go look for articles on sex positivity or body positivity, because then you're going into everything the internet has to offer on that, and they go down rabbit holes, or if they'll Google like feminism and sex and who knows what comes up. And so, but having them directly linked to library databases seems to help. And taking that time at the beginning of the semester to show them how to navigate that. It doesn't take 10 minutes, right? And then they kind of understand, but it's like I said, it's handing over the reins of what we're going to read together as a class. And ultimately, hopefully the goal is that then later the class becomes a community enough to where you do that together as a class. Of course, I was facilitating that, but they were so used to following the path on their own that when we came together and they were collectively doing it as a class about 3/4 of the way through the semester, then it was organic, and I could tell like students could see that they were embarking upon this journey together. We all wanted to know what each other thought. We were invested in learning from each other at that point as a community of at least like-minded enough to be taking the class this far. It was really encouraging to see similar experiences have happened in the mothering class, especially during COVID, when that demographic was incredibly stressed. So whatever I would have had planned just went out the window. And listening to students and like, what do you need to learn right now to help you navigate lockdowns, children at home? How can we apply feminist mothering? Why is this important? It became very real. And then of course we're looking at the Portland, Oregon wall of moms, the protests happening at that point. And so how does this, what's happening in our culture and how we're positioned right now in this class as scholars. And so that was very powerful to see too. But I think just in the intro classes, yes, I see the risk of going all over, and so I really direct them. But when you get into the upper level of smaller classes and the themes are much more specific in the class, then I've seen just wonderful success with it.
So it sounds like they need, kind of like their own reframing and their own training on how to navigate those resources. And then it opens up like a really wide, a different type and very rich type of discussions. So it sounds like there is, or I see a question from Rachel in the Q&A box, and Rachel is asking, in large classes, student assessment is often an issue that is raised as a barrier to adopting OER. And how do you address assessment in your practice?
Yeah, I have a piece in my essay. I have no idea what page it's on, but I'm just going to speak off the cuff so I don't have to rummage through my papers. But in my classes, one of the big drawbacks is that it's students like, oh, this is going to be an easy A or a blow off. And then when they're required to do the work and to find those OERs, then it's like, oh, it becomes draining. And I have gotten students who will say this is indoctrination, this is, brainwashing, but all of that assessment was, that critique was already there prior to implementing OER. I have found that my assessment has not really changed much by switching. What has most often happened is students who were struggling have been brought up. And it's kind of picked up more students, not all of them though. So in thinking about student evaluations as a form of assessment, I've seen very little change, if not just for the positive. So that the negative has stayed the same, but there's more positive. And so that, to me, and when you're teaching, hundreds of students at one time each semester, I think that's about as much success. You can expect everyone to love the class, especially when it's labeled as a diversity class and how politicized that is at this time. But if you're talking about the daily, like, assessing and grading, I have in the intro classes, I have criteria that I'm looking for. So I want you to find this type of source, maybe like within a week frame, they find 3 different sources. They make connections between those sources to a course theme, a unit theme, and then they go on and look at sources that other students and relate their sources to at least 3 other students' sources. So I'm looking for specific criteria. Did they even do that? I don't care what argument they're making while doing that, or the position that they inevitably take. Did they meet those criteria? Because in doing that, they're going to have to do the research on their own, make connections on their own, and then make connections with the broader other students, and all of that should be going back to our course themes. So by the time they've done all that, that's what I want them to be doing, regardless of what they got out of it. And that I know probably feels much different than, say, requirements in a composition class or a literature class where you're checking for certain thing. It's the process I'm checking through my assessment, not the necessarily the argument that they're coming up with. Does that answer the question? Okay.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Rachel. And when you say feel free to I think we have time for maybe one other question, but if you how do you get students to connect their kind of sources to other students' sources? Do you mean like they come to class and then they just cite, read a little bit of their source, or do you use like social annotations? Do you use a discussion board? How do you do that?
Mine for the last 3 years have all been online, so I use discussion boards.
Discussion
So
board, okay.
yeah, by Wednesday they post their own thoughts and their own hyperlinked OER sources, and then they have until Friday to make connections between what they posted and what someone else has posted, and then I have the weekend to digest as much as possible and assess, and then I change what I have like an outline, of course, having taught it so many times, but I'm able to do that pivoting over the weekend prior to what I then assigned a direction we go to. And I always do like a 5-minute video with the class, like, hey, I love that we went here, here, here. We're going to map onto that this week. I'm going to ask you to then take it and go this way. If you need to go back to discussion board and, join some of these threads and reread them, that's fine. That if you weren't on that particular desired line, jump on with us now. We're going to follow that. What I will say, what I am a stickler about is that means no late work. They have a 5-day window to post, and then I have to have that weekend. And the class can't, you can't miss 2 weeks and then like, hey, can I go back and like email you my post? No, our class is focused on communicating and discussing with one another. You missed it. Jump on now and start giving your fellow classmates that respect of joining the conversation, and that is really hard for a lot of students. I will say that's one of the drawbacks. No late work in the class, because our conversation's rolling and building on it each week.
Right, so there's flexibility with the it's responsive in terms of how you're able to really kind of tailor the discussion or direct it based on what students are actually coming up with, but that also means that they all have to submit at the same time, and I think it's really, especially in online asynchronous classes, I think it's really important to have that kind of like just in time feedback that they would get in a real not in a real I'm sorry, in an in-person classroom. Online classrooms are entirely very real classroom. So if there's no other questions, and it doesn't look, let me just double check. So I think I just want to thank you, Dr. Turcat, for sharing about your experience and expertise, aligning your use of OER with feminist pedagogy. And as we wrap up this day of great sessions, I just want to point out that there's another concurrent session. It started a little after hours at 3:30, and it will be going on until 4:20. And I am going to put the link in the chat if you want to pop in for the last about half hour. And otherwise, since this is our last concurrent session, the Missouri A&OER Planning Committee thanks all of you for attending the conference and for presenting. And please look for an email from us sometime next week with a link to any PowerPoints that we may have received from presenters, recordings as well, and then to give conference feedback. So we really want to hear from you and what you thought about the overall conference. So be on the lookout for that. And thanks to our speaker and to all of our attendees, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.